up and get dirty. Digital, this is going to be fast and clean. Not at all. It's like, I have an idea, I got to use HTML to get this idea across today. You know, so I'm never thinking like, oh, it's montage day. I better, you know, it's like you just, like I said earlier, those are all tools you get to use. You know, today I'm gonna write a poem. I got to write a poem today.
You know, plus once you, to your first point too, like once you put something out in the world, like you actually build it, or you actually print it, or you actually put it in an exhibit, or whatever it is that you do to it, and you realize that you hadn't gone past the surface enough, it changes you pretty quickly. You know, that happens less and less as time goes on. Right? You hold.
Yeah, I think, Joshua, you brought up a great point about those all being tools that are disposal, but kind of, I guess, our expertise comes from knowing when it's appropriate to use which tools, like what's the most effective way to communicate the ideas, both as our own process as well as in terms of how we want the viewer to engage the work, right?
I think last night at dinner we were talking, we haven't mentioned it today, but the Richard Meier selected Collage Works in terms of, to answer your question, Daniel, perhaps that what's the role of collage in his work? And so for the first time that we get to see this new series of 10, which are quite unique, because the other ones tended to involve travel. They were done, as Marlene was commenting yesterday, the lecture on the airplane. You know, so they had an absolute role. You could see him coming home and decompressing these fragments and putting them to use to create. The new ones aren't that role, the architect traveling, creating these works of art. And so the conversation we had last night at dinner, not to sort of divulge what was decided upon, but it's something that I think there'll be a lot of discussion in terms of the two walls that are over there, as well as the other travel ones that he premiered at the High many years back. But what those serve in the discourse about collage and how they also then work within the realm of an architect doing collage, and whether or not it enhances or allows you to better understand who he is, or if it does something for his architecture.
But I think it's also a departure from his practice in the sense that it's always been this daily personal ritual for Meier that was about just reflecting and, as he says, doing something other than architecture. And yet in these pieces he's collaborating and he's in a way critiquing his previous work instead of his traditional practice of making a collage, putting it in a book, or working directly in a book where they're not meant to be viewed. So I think it is, even though at first glance they appear sort of aesthetically similar, the process is really different.
You know, and I just want to reinforce Daniel's question, because it's the artists and the architects here. It's really a fundamental challenge. At a certain point, are we looking at graphic design, or are we looking at architectural design in the presentation? And because both are means of communication, but we're filtered. You know, we're really designing three-dimensional space, but we're presenting it graphically. And a really good designer can do both really well. But there are conditions where the graphic design is just so incredibly seductive that you assume the architecture is going to be that way too. And you can't rely on, when you can see it right away. No, you can't always see it right away. And you can't rely on, you can't rely on things you build and then you'll know.
I guess I was looking at it from a conceptual perspective, not a...
But it's a real challenge, I think, as an educator, it's a challenge. I think that our students produce presentations, and it's important that they're excellent, but they represent a different reality as well, and both of them have to be good.
Well, I mean, one could argue that we're closer to literature than we are to building in the College of Architecture. Might get attacked for it, but we create representations of architecture. And Haydock has a brilliant article where he goes through all those different levels and strategies and collage becomes one of those. And Adolf Loos said it best. He said that we have to be careful because we have to be wary because there are graphic designers among us. And he said, if I want a chair rail here, I'll go to the site and I'll point to the wall and I'll say, put it here. But he's not drawing architecture. I mean, he's making a very clear theoretical spatial construct. I think that, this is why I wish there were more examples of architectural collage in the exhibit. when you think
Me
of
too.
the history of the recent photos at MoMA. I mean, it's, those early Mies drawings, the Razor House, the Friedrich Strauss drawings, I mean, there's no fluff in there. I mean, and it is what it is. I mean, it's actually less than what it is. I mean, you see a Paul Klee painting, a piece of millwork, and a scene to the mountains. And the reality of that architecture is one to one. It's a better representation in some respects than the architecture. So I think it goes the other way too. I think you can have things that are rather minimal collage that look like less than they are. They actually convey more information in terms of the objects that are chosen.
Yeah.
So-
I mean, that's montage, not really collage.
Well, that's this issue of, I mean, but you can, it's a combination of found objects in a sense that I hope that the discussion today has allowed those to coexist.
Do architects find safety in the label of montage, like safety in collage or safety in this is montage? Is there safety in labeling?
I think it's what you said is that, I mean, I don't think any designer, I think that if a fluent designer basically uses all the tools that they're accessible to them. And my thing is that we no longer teach a class called table saw or band saw, but we teach classes on CNC, and that eventually those will be absorbed and they'll become another tool. But I think there isn't a tendency to be obsessed with montage, photo montage, in the way in which presentations are made. But that's constantly evolving and constantly changing.
I only say it in like as collage, the intent of those original early modernist explorations were to not like add a new language. It was like to destroy what was happening, you know?
I mean, I use collage very interchangeably. I really do. I don't make big distinctions.
Right.
Because to me, it's really just about a way of perceiving the world and a way of expressing the world in a kind of as a sort of constructive endeavor, you know. But I don't. I don't think that there was ever. I don't think that there was ever this whole or this classical idea that somehow existed and then suddenly didn't. I think we've always been a culture of fragments, and really it's just that, because really the idea, even when you go back to realist painting and all of that, I mean, those are constructions. Those are constructions. It's a constructed reality, perspectival space, all that stuff. I mean, it's just, so I don't, you know, this whole rabbit hole of collage really did change. It became my way of reading everything pretty much. So I wouldn't get too caught up on this idea. Well, when is it photo montage versus collage and so on? I mean, you know, the principles are kind of the same. It just has to do almost with seams or no seams to me.
But I do think that there's an important distinction between seeing collage or montage, whatever you want to call it, as an end result, something that can be framed and put on a wall and seen as an object, and collage as a process. It's a device that you use to study other things. And that, you know, maybe for Richard Meier, having scraps of paper that were tickets and this and that and whatever was just a way of practicing form making while he was sitting in the airplane or wherever it is. I haven't had time to look at these very carefully, but it seems to me that these are a little more about, about the end result than about the process, but I could be wrong about that. But I think that's a very important distinction, because for me, those early sort of, you know, fine art collages, I guess, the distinction between the folk art and the fine art, Picasso's and all of those were a sort of, you know, it was a kind of a joke on the art world that we were, you know, taking these shortcuts and sort of sampling all kinds of things from other people, wallpapers, newspapers, this and that, putting it all together, putting it in a frame, calling it an object and end result. Where in some ways it was just an expediency, a shortcut to study something, but then now all of a sudden we're calling it an result.
Well, I think that those artists, I mean, the Cubists and Futurists, so I mean, in context, I think those were really, radical gestures. because it was a total disruption into this notion of the picture plane as a, as a kind of unified thing, as a whole. And it was also the intrusion of the real world into the constructive world of the painting. And so I think, but I do think that it was not just, I do think it was also a response to the turn of that century, the same way what's happening now. We are in something so similar right now, to my mind. And I'll be the first to admit, I'm very much trying to make sense of it, because I'm, being kind of analog, and, I'm using all the same tools that the students here are using, minus CAD and all that, because I don't know how that works. But I'm using a lot of the same tools in my daily life, and trying to understand, not just aesthetically, how to plug this into my understanding of, art and its role and how it connects to culture and so on, but trying to sort of see a way forward. I don't know yet. I don't think any of us do.
I think that-
Yeah,
The first sentence, sorry. It's fast. The first sentence of your lecture yesterday was collage is the language of rupture.
Right.
Right.